"What is the matter, Wilson?" said Lord Glenarvan, scarcely able to control himself. "We can do nothing. Ayrton, bring the ox and horse that are left. They must extricate us from the difficulty." "If the cart were once out of the mud," replied Captain Mangles, "these two animals, by short journeys, could draw it to the coast. We must therefore, at all events, release the clumsy vehicle." "We will try, John," said Glenarvan. "Let us return to camp, for there must be anxiety at our long absence." Ayrton took charge of the ox and Mulrady of the horse, and the party returned along the winding banks of the river. Half an hour after, Paganel, MacNab, Lady Helena, and Miss Grant were told the state of affairs. "By my faith," the Major could not help exclaiming, "it is a pity, Ayrton, that you did not shoe all our animals on crossing the Wimmera." "Why so, sir?" asked Ayrton. "Because of all our horses, only the one you put into the hands of the farrier has escaped the common fate." "That is true," said Captain Mangles, "and it is a singular coincidence." "Mistakes and misapprehensions." "A coincidence and nothing more," replied the quartermaster, gazing fixedly at the Major. MacNab compressed his lips, as if he would repress the words ready to burst from them. Glenarvan, the captain, and Lady Helena seemed to expect that he would finish his sentence, but he remained silent and walked towards the cart, which Ayrton was now examining. "What did he mean?" inquired Glenarvan of Captain Mangles. "I do not know," replied the young captain. "However, the Major is not the man to speak without cause." "No," said Lady Helena, "Major MacNab must have suspicions of Ayrton." "What suspicions?" asked Glenarvan. "Does he suppose him capable of killing our horses and oxen? For what purpose, pray? Are not Ayrton's interests identical with ours?" "You are right, my dear Edward," said Lady Helena. "Besides, the quartermaster has given us, ever since the beginning of the journey, indubitable proofs of his devotion to our comfort." "True," replied Captain Mangles. "But then, what does the Major's remark mean? I must have an understanding." "Perhaps he thinks he is in league with these convicts," remarked Paganel, imprudently. "What convicts?" inquired Miss Grant. "Monsieur Paganel is mistaken," said Captain Mangles quickly. "He knows that there are no convicts in the province of Victoria." "Yes, yes, that is so," eagerly replied Paganel, who would fain have retracted his words. "What could I have been thinking of? Convicts? Who ever heard of convicts in Australia? Moreover, as soon as they land, they make very honest people. The climate, you know, Miss Mary, the moral effect of the climate." In his desire to correct his blunder, the poor geographer became hopelessly involved. Lady Helena looked at him, wondering what had deprived him of his usual coolness. But not wishing to embarrass him further, she retired with Mary to the tent, where Mr. Albinett was engaged in preparing breakfast. "I deserve to be transported myself," said Paganel piteously. "I think so," replied Glenarvan. Ayrton and the two sailors were still trying to extricate the cart. The ox and the horse, yoked side by side, were pulling with all their strength. The traces were stretched almost to breaking, and the bows threatened to give way to the strain. Wilson and Mulrady pushed at the wheels, while the quartermaster, with voice and whip, urged on the ill-matched team. But the heavy vehicle did not stir. The clay, now dry, held it as if it had been cemented. Captain Mangles wetted the clay to make it yield, but to no purpose. The cart was immovable. Unless the vehicle was taken to pieces, they must give up the idea of getting it out of the quagmire. As tools were wanting, of course they could not undertake such a task. Ayrton, however, who seemed determined to overcome the difficulty at any cost, was about to renew his exertions, when Lord Glenarvan stopped him. "Enough, Ayrton, enough," said he. "We must be careful of the ox and horse that remain. If we are to continue our journey on foot, one can carry the two ladies and the other the provisions. They may do us good service yet." "Very well, my lord," replied the quartermaster, unyoking his exhausted animals. "Now, my friends," added Glenarvan, "let us return to camp, deliberate, consider our situation, know what our chances are, and come to a resolution." But the heavy vehicle did not stir. The clay, now dry, held it as if it had been cemented. A few minutes after, the travelers were indemnifying themselves for their sleeplessness the past night by a good breakfast, and the discussion of their affairs began. The first question was to determine the exact position of the encampment. Paganel was charged with this duty, and fulfilled it with his customary precision. "How far are we from Twofold Bay?" asked Glenarvan. 75 miles, replied Paganel. "And Melbourne is 200 miles distant, at least." "Very well, our position being determined," continued Glenarvan, "what is it best to do?" The answer was unanimous: make for the coast without delay. Lady Helena and Mary Grant engaged to travel 15 miles a day. The courageous women did not shrink from traversing the entire distance on foot, if necessary. "But are we certain to find at the bay the resources that we need?" asked Glenarvan. "Without doubt," replied Paganel. "Eden is not a new municipality, and its harbor must have frequent communication with Melbourne. I even believe that 35 miles from here, at the parish of Delegate, we can obtain provisions and the means of conveyance." "And the Duncan?" asked Ayrton. "Do you not think it advisable to order her to the bay?" "What say you, Captain?" said Glenarvan. "I do not think that there is any necessity for such a proceeding," replied the young captain, after reflection. "There will be plenty of time to send your orders to Tom Austin and summon him to the coast." "That is quite true," added Paganel. "Besides," continued Captain Mangles, "in 4 or 5 days we shall be at Eden." 4 or 5 days, interposed Ayrton, shaking his head. "Say 15 or 20, Captain, if you do not wish to regret your error hereafter." "Difficulties foreseen." 15 or 20 days to make 75 miles, exclaimed Glenarvan. "At least, my lord, you will have to cross the most difficult portion of Victoria, plains covered with underbrush, without any cleared roads, where it has been impossible to establish stations. You will have to travel with the hatchet or the torch in your hand, and believe me, you will not advance rapidly." Ayrton's tone was that of a man who is thoroughly acquainted with his subject. Paganel, towards whom questioning glances were turned, nodded approvingly at the words of the quartermaster. "I acknowledge the difficulties," said Captain Mangles at length. "Well, in 15 days, my lord, you can send your orders to the Duncan." "I may add," resumed Ayrton, "that the principal obstacles do not proceed from the roughness of the journey. We must cross the Snowy, and very probably have to wait for the subsidence of the waters." "Wait," cried the captain, "can we not find a ford?" "I think not," replied Ayrton. "This morning I searched in vain for a practicable one. It is unusual to find a river so much swollen at this season. It is a fatality against which I am powerless." "This Snowy River is broad, then," remarked Lady Glenarvan. "Broad and deep, madam," answered Ayrton, "a mile in breadth with a strong current. A good swimmer could not cross it without danger." "Well then, let us build a boat," cried Robert, who was never at fault for a plan. "We can cut down a tree, hollow it out, embark, and the thing is done." "Good for the son of Captain Grant," replied Paganel. "The boy is right," continued Captain Mangles. "We shall be forced to this. I therefore think it useless to waste our time in further discussions." "What do you think, Ayrton?" asked Glenarvan. "I think, my lord, that if no assistance comes, in a month we shall still be detained on the banks of the Snowy." "But have you a better plan?" inquired Captain Mangles, somewhat impatiently. "Yes, let the Duncan leave Melbourne, and sail to the eastern coast." "How can her presence in the bay assist us to arrive there?" Ayrton meditated for a few moments, and then said, evasively, "I do not wish to obtrude my opinion. What I do is for the interest of all, and I am disposed to start as soon as your lordship gives the signal for departure." Then he folded his arms. "That is no answer, Ayrton," continued Glenarvan. "Tell us your plan and we will discuss it. What do you propose?" In a calm and confident tone, the quartermaster thereupon expressed himself as follows. "I propose that we do not venture beyond the Snowy in our present destitute condition. We must wait for assistance in this very place, and this assistance can come only from the Duncan. Let us encamp here where provisions are not wanting, while one of us carries to Tom Austin the order to repair to Twofold Bay." This unexpected proposal was received with a murmur of astonishment, and Captain Mangles took no pains to conceal his aversion. "In the meantime," continued Ayrton, "either the waters of the Snowy will have subsided, which will enable us to find a practicable ford, or we shall have to resort to a boat, and shall have time to construct it. This, my lord, is the plan which I submit to your approval. If it please your lordship, I will go. Very well, Ayrton, replied Glenarvan. Your idea deserves to be seriously considered. Its greatest objection is the delay it will cause, but it spares us severe hardships and perhaps real dangers. What do you think, friends? Let us hear your advice, Major, said Lady Helena. During the whole discussion you have contented yourself with listening simply. Since you ask my opinion, answered the Major, I will give it to you very frankly. Ayrton seems to me to have spoken like a wise and prudent man, and I advocate his proposition. This answer was rather unexpected, for hitherto MacNab had always opposed Ayrton's ideas on this subject. Ayrton, too, was surprised, and cast a quick glance at the Major. Paganel, Lady Helena, and the sailors had been favorably disposed to the quartermaster's project, and no longer hesitated after MacNab's declaration. Glenarvan, therefore, announced that Ayrton's plan was adopted. And now, Captain, added he, do you not think that prudence dictates this course, and that we should encamp on the banks of the river while waiting for the means of conveyance? Yes, replied Captain Mangles, if the messenger succeeds in crossing the Snowy, which we cannot cross ourselves. All looked at the quartermaster, who smiled with the air of a man who knows perfectly well what he is about to do. The messenger will not cross the river, said he. Ah, cried Captain Mangles. He will strike the Lucknow road, which will take him direct to Melbourne. 200 miles on foot, exclaimed the captain. On horseback, continued Ayrton. There is one good horse left. It will be a journey of but 4 days. Add 2 days for the Duncan to reach the bay, 24 hours for the return to the encampment, and in a week the messenger will be back again with the crew. Candidates for office. The Major again nodded approvingly at these words, to the great astonishment of Captain Mangles. But the quartermaster's proposition had gained all the votes, and the only question was how to execute this apparently well-conceived plan. Now, my friends, said Glenarvan, it remains only to choose our messenger. He will have a difficult and dangerous mission, that is certain. Who is willing to devote himself for his companions and carry our instructions to Melbourne? Wilson, Mulready, Captain Mangles, Paganel, and Robert offered themselves immediately. The captain particularly insisted that this mission should be confided to him, but Ayrton, who had not yet finished, resumed the conversation and said, If it please your lordship, I will go. I am acquainted with the country and have often crossed more difficult regions. I can extricate myself where another would fail. I therefore claim, for the common welfare, the right to go to Melbourne. 1 word will place me on a good footing with your mate, and in 6 days I engage to bring the Duncan to Twofold Bay. Well said, replied Glenarvan. You are a brave and intelligent man, Ayrton, and will succeed. The quartermaster was evidently more capable than anyone else of fulfilling this difficult mission. Captain Mangles raised one final objection, that Ayrton's presence was necessary to enable them to find traces of the Britannia or Captain Grant. But the Major observed that they should remain encamped on the banks of the Snowy till the messenger's return, that it was not proposed to resume the search without him, and that consequently his absence could be in no way prejudicial to their interests. Well then, Ayrton, start, said Glenarvan. Make haste and return to the encampment by way of Eden. A gleam of satisfaction seemed to light up the eyes of the quartermaster. He turned his head to one side, though not so quickly, but that Captain Mangles had intercepted his glance, and instinctively felt his suspicions increased. The quartermaster made his preparations for departure, aided by the 2 sailors, one of whom attended to his horse, and the other to his provisions. Meantime Glenarvan wrote the letter designed for Tom Austin. He ordered the mate of the Duncan to repair without delay to Twofold Bay, and recommended the quartermaster to him as a man in whom he could place entire confidence. As soon as he arrived at the bay, he was to send a detachment of sailors under the command of Ayrton. He had just reached this part of his letter, when the Major, who had been looking over his shoulder, asked him, in a singular tone, how he wrote the word Ayrton. As it is pronounced, replied Glenarvan. That is a mistake, said the Major coolly. It is pronounced Ayrton, but it is written Ben Joyce. Chapter 41. The plot unveiled. The sound of the name of Ben Joyce fell upon the party like a thunderbolt. Ayrton suddenly sprang to his feet. In his hand was a revolver. A report was heard, and Glenarvan fell, struck by a bullet. Before Captain Mangles and the sailors recovered from the surprise into which this unexpected turn of affairs had thrown them, the audacious convict had escaped, and joined his band, scattered along the edge of the wood of gum trees. A report was heard, and Glenarvan fell, struck by a bullet. The tent did not offer a sufficient shelter against the bullets, and it was clearly necessary to beat a retreat. Glenarvan, who was but slightly injured, had risen. To the cart," cried Captain Mangles, as he hurried on Lady Helena and Mary Grant, who were soon in safety behind its stout sides. The captain, the major, Paganel, and the sailors then seized their rifles, and stood ready to repel the convicts. Glenarvan and Robert had joined the ladies, while Albinett hastened to the common defense. These events had transpired with the rapidity of lightning. Captain Mangles attentively watched the edge of the wood, but the reports suddenly ceased on the arrival of Ben Joyce, and a profound silence succeeded the noisy fusillade. A few wreaths of white smoke were still curling up between the branches of the gum trees, but the tall tufts of gastrolobium were motionless, and all signs of attack had disappeared. The Major and Captain Mangles extended their examinations as far as the great trees. The place was abandoned. Numerous footprints were seen, and a few half-burnt cartridges smoked on the ground. The Major, like a prudent man, extinguished them, for a spark was enough to kindle a formidable conflagration in this forest of dry trees. "The convicts have disappeared," said Captain Mangles. "Yes," replied the Major, "and this disappearance alarms me. I should prefer to meet them face to face. It is better to encounter a tiger in the open plain than a serpent in the grass. Let us search these bushes around the cart." Unravelings. The Major and Captain scoured the surrounding country, but from the edge of the wood to the banks of the Snowy, they did not meet with a single convict. Ben Joyce's band seemed to have flown away like a flock of mischievous birds. This disappearance was too strange to inspire a perfect security. They therefore resolved to keep on the watch. The cart, which was a really immovable fortress, became the center of the encampment, and two men kept guard, relieving each other every hour. Lady Helena and Mary Grant's first care had been to dress Glenarvan's wound. At the very moment that her husband fell from Ben Joyce's bullet, in her terror she had rushed towards him. Then, controlling her emotion, this courageous woman had assisted Glenarvan to the cart. Here the shoulder of the wounded man was laid bare, and the Major perceived that the ball had lacerated the flesh, causing no other injury. Neither bones nor large muscles seemed affected. The wound bled considerably, but Glenarvan, by moving the fingers of his hand and forearm, encouraged his friends to expect a favorable result. When his wound was dressed, he no longer desired any attention, and explanations followed. The travelers, except Wilson and Mulready, who were keeping guard outside, had taken seats as well as possible in the cart, and the Major was requested to speak. Before beginning his story, he informed Lady Helena of the escape of a band of convicts from Perth, their appearance in the province of Victoria, and their complicity in the railway disaster. He gave her the number of the Australian and New Zealand Gazette purchased at Seymour, and added that the police had set a price on the head of Ben Joyce, a formidable bandit, whom 18 months of crime had given a widespread notoriety. But how had MacNab recognized this Ben Joyce in the quartermaster Ayrton? Here was the mystery that all wished to solve, and the Major explained. Since the day of his meeting with Ayrton he had suspected him. 2 or 3 almost insignificant circumstances, a glance exchanged between the quartermaster and the farrier at Weimar River, Ayrton's hesitation to pass through the towns and villages, his strong wish to order the Duncan to the coast, the strange death of the animals confided to his care, and finally, a want of frankness in his actions. All these facts, gradually noticed, had roused the Major's suspicions. However, he could form no direct accusation until the events that had transpired the preceding night. Gliding between the tall clumps of shrubbery, as was related in the previous chapter, he approached near the suspicious shadows that had attracted his attention half a mile from the encampment. The phosphorescent plants cast their pale rays through the darkness. 3 men were examining some tracks on the ground, and among them, he recognized the farrier of Black Point Station. "Here they are," said one. "Yes," replied another, "here is the trefoil of the hoofs again. It has been like this since leaving the Wimmera. All the horses are dead. The poison is not far away." There is enough here to settle an entire troop of cavalry. This gastrolobium is a useful plant." Then they were silent, added MacNab, and departed. I wanted to know more. I followed them. The conversation soon began again. "A cunning man, this Ben Joyce," said the farrier, "a famous quartermaster with his invented shipwreck. If his plan succeeds, it will be a stroke of fortune. Devilish Ayrton, call him Ben Joyce, for he has well earned his name." These rascals then left the wood of gum trees. I knew what I wished, and returned to the encampment with the certainty that all the convicts in Australia are not reformed, in spite of Paganel's arguments. "Then," said Glenarvan, whose face was pale with anger, "Ayrton has brought us here to rob and assassinate us." "Yes," replied the Major. "And since leaving the Wimmera, his band has followed and watched us, waiting for a favorable opportunity." "From depth to depths." "Yes." "But this wretch is not, then, a sailor of the Britannia. He has stolen his name and contract." All eyes were turned towards MacNab, who must have considered this matter. "These," replied he in his calm voice, "are the proofs that can be derived from this obscure state of affairs. In my opinion, this man's real name is Ayrton. Ben Joyce is his fighting title. It is certain that he knows Harry Grant, and has been quartermaster on board the Britannia. These facts, proved already by the precise details given by Ayrton, are still further corroborated by the conversation of the convicts that I have related. Let us not, therefore, be led astray by vain conjectures, but only be certain that Ayrton is Ben Joyce, a sailor of the Britannia, now chief of a band of convicts." The Major's explanation was accepted as conclusive. "Now," replied Glenarvan, "will you tell me how and why Harry Grant's quartermaster is in Australia?" "How, I do not know," said MacNab, "and the police declare they know no more than I on the subject. Why, it is also impossible for me to say. Here is a mystery that the future will explain." "The police do not even know the identity of Ayrton and Ben Joyce," said Captain Mangles. "You are right, John," replied the Major, "and such information would be likely to facilitate their search." "This unfortunate, then," remarked Lady Helena, "intruded into O'Moore's farm with a criminal intention." "There is no doubt of it," continued MacNab. "He was meditating some hostile attack upon the Irishman when a better opportunity was offered. Chance threw us in his way. He heard Glenarvan's story of the shipwreck, and like a bold man, he promptly decided to take part in the expedition. At the Wimmera he communicated with one of his friends, the farrier of Black Point, and thus left distinguishable traces of our course. His band followed us. A poisonous plant enabled him to gradually kill our oxen and horses. Then, at the proper moment, he entangled us in the marshes of the Snowy, and surrendered us to the convicts he commanded." Everything possible had been said concerning Ben Joyce. His past had just been reviewed by the Major, and the wretch appeared as he was, a bold and formidable criminal. His intentions had been clearly proved, and required, on the part of Glenarvan, extreme vigilance. Fortunately, there was less to fear from the detected bandit than the secret traitor. But one serious fact appeared from this explanation. No one had yet thought of it. Only Mary Grant, disregarding the past, looked forward to the future. Captain Mangles first saw her pale and disconsolate. He understood what was passing in her mind. "Miss Mary," cried he, "you are weeping." "What is the matter, my child?" asked Lady Helena. "My father, madam, my father," replied the young girl. She could not continue, but a sudden revelation dawned on the mind of each. They comprehended Mary's grief, why the tears flowed from her eyes, why the name of her father rose to her lips. The discovery of Ayrton's treachery destroyed all hope. The convict, to entice Glenarvan on, had invented a shipwreck. In their conversation, overheard by MacNab, his accomplices had clearly confessed it. The Britannia had never been wrecked on the reefs of Twofold Bay. Harry Grant had never set foot on the Australian continent. For the second time, an erroneous interpretation of the document had set the searchers of the Britannia on a false trail. All, in the face of this situation and the grief of the two children, preserved a mournful silence. Who then could have found words of hope? Robert wept in his sister's arms. Paganel murmured in a voice of despair. Calm and cloudiness. Ah, unlucky document! You can boast of having sorely puzzled the brains of a dozen brave people. And the worthy geographer was fairly furious against himself, and frantically beat his forehead. In the meantime, Glenarvan had joined Mulrady and Wilson, who were on guard without. A deep silence reigned on the plain lying between the wood and the river. Heavy clouds covered the vault of the sky. In this deadened and torpid atmosphere, the least sound would have been clearly transmitted, but nothing was heard. Ben Joyce and his band must have fled to a considerable distance, for flocks of birds that sported on the low branches of the trees, several kangaroos peacefully browsing on the young shoots, and a pair of cassowaries, whose unsuspecting heads were thrust between the tall bushes, proved that the presence of man did not disturb these peaceful solitudes. "You have not seen nor heard anything for an hour?" inquired Glenarvan of the two sailors. "Nothing, my lord," replied Wilson. "The convicts must be several miles away." "They cannot have been in sufficient force to attack us," added Mulrady. "This Ben Joyce probably intended to recruit some bandits, like himself, among the bushrangers that wander at the foot of the Alps." "Very likely, Mulrady," replied Glenarvan. "These rascals are cowards. They know we are well armed, and are perhaps waiting for darkness to commence their attack. We must redouble our vigilance at nightfall. If we could only leave this marshy plain and pursue our journey towards the coast, but the swollen waters of the river bar our progress. I would pay its weight in gold for a raft that would transport us to the other side." "Why," said Wilson, "does not your lordship give us the order to construct this raft? There is plenty of wood." "No, Wilson," answered Glenarvan. "This Snowy is not a river, it is an impassable torrent." A pair of cassowaries proved that the presence of man did not disturb these peaceful solitudes. Readiness for service. At this moment Captain Mangles, the Major, and Paganel joined Glenarvan. They had been to examine the Snowy. The waters, swollen by the recent rains, had risen a foot above low water mark, and formed an impetuous current. It was impossible to venture upon this roaring deluge, these rushing floods, broken into 1,000 eddies by the depressions of the riverbed. Captain Mangles declared that the passage was impracticable. "But," added he, "we ought not to remain here without making any attempt. What we wished to do before Ayrton's treason is still more necessary now." "What do you say, Captain?" asked Glenarvan. "I say that assistance is needed, and since we cannot go to Twofold Bay, we must go to Melbourne. One horse is left. Let your lordship give him to me, and I will go." "But it is a perilous venture, John," said Glenarvan. "Aside from the dangers of this journey of 200 miles across an unknown country, all the roads may be guarded by Ben Joyce's accomplices." "I know it, my lord, but I know, too, that our situation cannot be prolonged. Ayrton only asked 8 days' absence to bring back the crew of the Duncan, but I will return in 6 days to the banks of the Snowy. What are your lordship's orders?" "Before Glenarvan speaks," said Paganel, "I must make a remark. It is well that one of us should go to Melbourne, but not that these dangers should be incurred by Captain Mangles. He is the captain of the Duncan, and must not therefore expose himself. Allow me to go in his place." "Well said," replied the Major, "but why should it be you, Paganel?" "Are we not here?" cried Wilson and Mulrady. "And do you believe," continued MacNab, "that I am afraid to make a journey of 200 miles on horseback?" "My friends," said Glenarvan, "if one of us is to go to Melbourne, let fate decide. Paganel, write our names." "Not yours at least, my lord," insisted Captain Mangles. "And why?" asked Glenarvan. "Separate you from Lady Helena, when your wound is not yet healed." "Glenarvan," interposed Paganel, "you cannot leave the encampment." "No," resumed the Major, "your place is here. Edward, you must not go." "There are dangers to incur," replied Glenarvan, "and I will not leave my part to others. Right, Paganel, let my name be mingled with those of my companions, and heaven grant that it may be the first drawn." All yielded to this wish, and Glenarvan's name was added to the others. They then proceeded to draw, and the lot fell upon Mulrady. The brave sailor uttered a cry of joy. "My lord, I am ready to go," said he. Glenarvan clasped his hand, and then turned towards the cart, leaving the Major and Captain Mangles to guard the encampment. Lady Helena was at once informed of the decision taken to send a messenger to Melbourne, and of the result of the drawing by lot. She spoke words to Mulrady that went to the heart of that noble sailor. They knew that he was brave, intelligent, hardy, and persevering. The lot could not have fallen better. It was decided that Mulrady should depart at 8 o'clock, after the short twilight. Wilson charged himself with getting the horse ready. He took the precaution to change the telltale shoe that he wore on his left foot, and to replace it by one belonging to the horses that had died in the night. The convicts could not now track Mulrady, or follow him, unless mounted. Another distraction. While Wilson was occupied with these arrangements, Glenarvan was preparing the letter designed for Tom Austin, but his wounded arm disabled him, and he asked Paganel to write for him. The geographer, who seemed absorbed in one idea, was oblivious to what was passing around him. It must be confessed that Paganel, in all this succession of sad misfortunes, thought only of his false interpretation of the document. He turned the words about in every way to draw from them a new meaning, and remained wrapped in these meditations. Thus he did not hear Glenarvan's request, and the latter was forced to repeat it. "Very well," replied Paganel, "I am ready." So saying, he mechanically produced his notebook. He tore out a blank page, and then, with his pencil in his hand, made ready to write. Glenarvan began to dictate the following instructions. Order for Tom Austin to put to sea, and bring the Duncan. Paganel had just finished this last word when his eyes fell upon the number of the Australian and New Zealand Gazette that lay upon the ground. The paper, being folded, only allowed him to see the two last syllables of its title. His pencil stopped, and he seemed to completely forget Glenarvan and his letter. "Well, Paganel," said Glenarvan. "Ah," continued the geographer, uttering a cry. "What is the matter?" asked the major. "Nothing's nothing," replied Paganel. Then in a lower tone he repeated, "Alland, Alland, Alland." He had risen, he had seized the paper. He shook it, seeking to repress words ready to escape his lips. Lady Helena, Mary, Robert, and Glenarvan gazed at him without understanding this inexplicable agitation. Paganel was like a man whom a sudden frenzy has seized. But this state of nervous excitation did not last. He gradually grew calm. The joy that gleamed in his eyes died away, and resuming his place, he said, in a quiet tone, "When you wish, my lord, I am at your disposal." Glenarvan continued the dictation of his letter, which was distinctly worded as follows. Order for Tom Austin to put to sea, and bring the Duncan to the eastern coast of Australia. "Australia," cried Paganel. "Ah yes, Australia." The letter was now finished, and presented to Glenarvan for his signature, who, although affected by his recent wound, acquitted himself as well as possible of this formality. The note was then folded and sealed, while Paganel, with a hand that still trembled from excitement, wrote the following address. Tom Austin, mate of the yacht Duncan, Melbourne. Thereupon he left the cart, gesticulating and repeating these incomprehensible words. Alland, Alland, Zealand. Chapter 42. 4 days of anguish. The rest of the day passed without any other incident. Everything was ready for the departure of Mulrady, who was happy to give his master this proof of his devotion. Paganel had regained his coolness and accustomed manners. His look still indicated an uneasy state of mind, but he appeared decided to keep his secret. He had doubtless strong reasons for acting thus, for the major overheard him repeating these words, like a man who is struggling with himself. No, no, they would not believe me, and besides, what use is it? It is too late. Adieu, my lord, said he, in a calm voice, and soon disappeared by a path along the edge of the wood. This resolution taken, he occupied himself with giving Mulrady the necessary directions for reaching Melbourne, and, with the map before him, marked out his course. All the trails of the prairie converged towards the Lucknow road, which, after extending straight southward to the coast, suddenly turned in the direction towards Melbourne. It was simply necessary to follow this, and not attempt to cross the unknown country. Mulrady could not, therefore, go astray. As for dangers, they lay only a few miles beyond the encampment, where Ben Joyce and his band were probably lying in wait. This point once passed, Mulrady was sure he could easily distance the convicts and accomplish his important mission. At 6 o'clock supper was eaten in common. A heavy rain was falling. The tent no longer afforded sufficient shelter, and each had taken refuge in the cart, which was a safe retreat. The sticky clay held it in its place as firm as a fort on its foundations. The firearms consisted of 7 rifles and 7 revolvers, and thus enabled them to sustain a long siege, for neither ammunition nor provisions were wanting. In 6 days the Duncan would anchor in Twofold Bay. 24 hours after, her crew would reach the opposite bank of the river, and if the passage was not then practicable, at least the convicts would be compelled to retreat before superior forces. But first of all, it was necessary that Mulrady should succeed in his enterprise. At 8 o'clock the darkness became intense. It was the time to start. The horse was brought out. His feet had been muffled, as an additional precaution, and made no sound. The animal seemed fatigued, but upon his surefootedness and endurance depended the safety of all. The major advised the sailor to spare his beast as soon as he was out of reach of the convicts. It was better to lose half a day and reach his destination safely. Captain Mangles gave him a revolver, which he had loaded with the greatest care. Mulrady mounted. A gloomy prospect. "Here is the letter which you are to take to Tom Austin," said Glenarvan. "Let him not lose an hour but start for Twofold Bay, and if he does not find us there, if we have not crossed the river, let him come to us without delay. Now go, my brave sailor, and may God guide you." Glenarvan, Lady Helena, Mary Grant, all clasped Mulrady's hand. This departure on a dark and stormy night, over a road beset with dangers, across the unknown stretches of a desert, would have appalled a heart less courageous than that of the sailor. "Adieu, my lord," said he, in a calm voice, and soon disappeared by a path along the edge of the wood. At that moment the tempest redoubled its violence. The lofty branches of the trees shook dismally in the darkness. You could hear the fall of the dry twigs on the drenched earth. More than one giant tree, whose sap was gone, but which had stood till then, fell during this terrible hurricane. The wind roared amid the cracking of the trees and mingled its mournful sounds with the rushing of the river. The heavy clouds that chased across the sky poured forth masses of mist, while a dismal darkness increased still more the horrors of the night. The travelers, after Mulrady's departure, ensconced themselves in the cart. Lady Helena, Mary Grant, Glenarvan, and Paganel occupied the front compartment, which had been made watertight. In the rear part, Albinett, Wilson, and Robert had found a sufficient shelter, while the Major and Captain Mangles were on guard without. This precaution was necessary, for an attack by the convicts was easy and possible. These two faithful guardians, therefore, took turns and philosophically received the blasts that blew sharply in their faces. They strove to pierce with their eyes the shades so favorable for an ambuscade, for the ear could detect nothing amid the din of the storm, the roaring of the wind, the rattling of the branches, the fall of trees, and the rushing of the impetuous waters. In the meantime, there were several lulls in the fury of the tempest, the wind ceasing as if to take breath. The river only moaned adown the motionless reeds and the black curtain of the gum trees, and the silence seemed more profound during these momentary rests. The Major and Captain Mangles now listened attentively. During one of these intervals, a sharp whistle reached their ears. The captain hastened to the Major. "Did you hear anything?" asked he. "Yes," replied MacNab. "Was it a man or an animal?" "A man," said the captain. They both listened again. The mysterious whistle was suddenly repeated, and something like a report followed it, but almost inaudibly, for the storm just then broke forth with renewed violence. They could not hear themselves talk, and took their stations to leeward of the cart. At this moment the leathern curtains were raised, and Glenarvan joined his two companions. He likewise had heard the suspicious whistle and the report. "From what direction?" he asked. "Yonder," said the captain, pointing to the dark line towards which Mulrady had gone. "How far?" "The wind carried it," was the reply. "It must be 3 miles distant at least." "Let us go," said Glenarvan, throwing his rifle over his shoulder. "No," interposed the Major. "It is a decoy to entice us away from the cart." "But if Mulrady has fallen beneath the shots of these wretches," continued Glenarvan, seizing MacNab's hand. "We shall know tomorrow," replied the latter, firmly determined to prevent Glenarvan from committing a useless imprudence. A cry in the night. "You cannot leave the encampment, my lord," said Captain Mangles. "I will go alone." "No," cried MacNab with energy. "Will you have us, then, perish singly, diminish our numbers, and be left to the mercy of these criminals? If Mulrady has been their victim, it is a calamity that we must not repeat a second time. He has gone according to lot. If the lot had chosen me, I should have gone like him, but should neither have asked nor expected any assistance." In restraining Glenarvan and Captain Mangles, the Major was right from every point of view. To attempt to reach the sailor, To go on such a dark night to meet the convicts, ambuscaded in some coppice, was useless madness. Glenarvan's little party did not number enough men to sacrifice any more. However, Glenarvan seemed unwilling to yield to these reasons. His hand played nervously with his rifle. He walked to and fro around the cart. He listened to the least sound. He strove to pierce the dismal obscurity. The thought that one of his friends was mortally wounded, helplessly abandoned, calling in vain upon those for whose sake he had sacrificed himself, tortured him. Mac Nab feared that he should not succeed in restraining him, that Glenarvan, carried away by his feelings, would cast himself into the power of Ben Joyce. "Edward," said he, "be calm, listen to a friend. Think of Lady Helena, Mary Grant, all who remain. Besides, where will you go? Where find Mulrady? He was attacked 2 miles distant at least. On what road? What path take?" At this very moment, as if in answer to the Major, a cry of distress was heard. "Listen," said Glenarvan. The cry came from the very direction whence the report had sounded, but less than a quarter of a mile distant. Glenarvan, pushing back Mac Nab, was advancing along the path, when not far from the cart, these words were uttered. "Help! Help!" It was a plaintive and despairing voice. Captain Mangles and the Major rushed towards it. In a few moments they perceived, on the edge of the coppice, a human form that was dragging itself along and groaning piteously. It was Mulrady, wounded and half dead. When his companions raised him, they felt their hands dabbling in blood. The rain now increased, and the wind howled through the branches of the dead trees. In the midst of these terrific gusts, Glenarvan, the Major, and the captain bore the body of Mulrady. On arriving at the cart, Paganel, Robert, Wilson, and Albinett came out, and Lady Helena gave up her room to the poor sailor. The Major took off Mulrady's vest, wet with blood and rain. He discovered the wound. It was a poniard stab, which the unfortunate had received in his right side. Mac Nab dressed it skillfully. Whether the weapon had reached the vital parts, he could not say. A stream of bright red blood spurted forth, while the paleness and the swoon of the wounded man proved that he had been seriously injured. The Major accordingly placed upon the opening of the wound, after first washing it with fresh water, a thick wad of tinder, and then a few layers of lint, confined by a bandage, and thus succeeded in stopping the hemorrhage. The patient was then laid on his side, his head and breast raised, and Lady Helena gave him a refreshing draught. At the end of a quarter of an hour, the wounded man, who had been motionless till then, made a movement. His eyes half opened, his lips murmured disconnected words, and the Major, putting down his ear, heard him say, "My lord, the letter, Ben Joyce." A day of doubt. The Major repeated these words and glanced at his companions. What did Mulrady mean? Ben Joyce had attacked the sailor, but why? Was it not simply for the purpose of preventing him from reaching the Duncan? This letter, Glenarvan examined the sailor's pockets. The letter addressed to Tom Austin was gone. The night passed in anxiety and anguish. They feared every moment that the wounded man would die. A burning fever consumed him. Lady Helena and Mary Grant, as though his sisters, did not leave him. Never was patient better nursed, or by more tender hands. Day appeared, the rain had ceased. Heavy clouds still rolled along the vault of the sky, and the earth was strewn with the fragments of branches. The clay, soaked by floods of water, had yielded, and the sides of the cart became unsteady but sank no deeper. Captain Mangles, Paganel, and Glenarvan took a tour of exploration around the camp. They traversed the path still marked with blood, but found no trace of Ben Joyce or his band. They went to the place where the attack had been made. Here 2 corpses lay on the ground, shot by Mulrady. One was the farrier of Black Point. His face, which had mortified, was a horrible sight. Glenarvan did not pursue his investigations farther, prudence forbidding. He therefore returned to the cart, much alarmed by the seriousness of the situation. "We cannot think of sending another messenger to Melbourne," said he. "But we must," replied Captain Mangles, "and I will make the attempt since my sailor has failed." "No, John, you have not even a horse to carry you these 200 miles. Indeed, Mulrady's horse, the only one that remained, had not reappeared. Had he fallen beneath the shots of the murderers? Was he running wild over the desert? Had the convicts captured him? In the midst of these terrific gusts, Glenarvan, the Major, and the captain bore the body of Mulrady. Resolution and recovery. "Whatever happens," continued Glenarvan, "we will separate no more. Let us wait 8 or 15 days, till the waters of the river resume their natural level. We will then reach Twofold Bay by short journeys, and from there send to the Duncan by a surer way the order to sail for the coast. This is the only feasible plan, replied Paganel. Well then, my friends, resumed Glenarvan, no more separation. A man risks too much to venture alone across this desert, infested with bandits, and now may God save our poor sailor and protect ourselves. Glenarvan was right in both resolves, first to forbid any single attempt to cross the plains, and next to wait patiently on the banks of the river for a practicable passage. Scarcely 35 miles separated them from Delegate, the first frontier town of New South Wales, where they would find means of reaching Twofold Bay. From this point, he could telegraph his orders to the Duncan. These measures were wise, but they had been adopted rather tardily. If they had not sent Mulrady with the letter, what misfortunes would have been avoided, not to speak of the attack upon the sailor. On arriving at the camp, Glenarvan found his companions less anxious. They seemed to have regained hope. "He is better," cried Robert, running to meet him. "Mulready's." "Yes, Edward," replied Lady Helena. "A reaction has taken place. The Major is more encouraged. Our sailor will live." "Where is MacNab?" asked Glenarvan. "With him. Mulready wished to speak with him. We must not disturb them."